I had a friend say to me over dinner the other night that fiction doesn't matter very much now. We need to focus on what's in front of us. I very respectfully, but very loudly and very vocally disagreed with him. Probing, questioning stories, they matter now. It's only by putting ourselves in the hearts and minds of other people that we can possibly develop empathy and connection. Good fiction is a roadmap of the soul, and we need it now more than ever. In the next months, Politics and Prose is hosting crucial fiction writers like Mohsin Hamid, Viet Thanh Nguyen, Roxane Gay, Rachel Cusk, and George Saunders. We need their words to stay alive, don't we? To keep our hearts pumping and bold. Paul Auster is a writer who's always kept our hearts pumping with his writing. He has delighted in surprising us and has always pushed himself into new explorations of form and language. His far-reaching, beloved body of work includes volumes of poetry, acclaimed screenplays, including Smoke and Blue in the Face, essays and memoirs, including The Invention of Solitude and Winter Journal, and of course, novels, including Moon Palace, Leviathan, Sunset Park, and the 3 volumes of the New York Trilogy. 4321, his first novel in 7 years, tells the story of 4 possible Archie Fergusons in a way that is at first, honestly, a little bit confounding, and ultimately, if you keep reading, it feels as organic and natural as life itself. It is, as NPR called it today, a stunningly ambitious novel. It's also obsessed with fate and choices, and more than anything, with what-ifs. As Auster said to The Guardian, how might things have turned out if I had gone to a different school, or I had not run into the person I married? These are the shadows of our other possible lives and deaths. And though the novel explores the tumultuous historical events of the 1960s, it has very real resonance for today. How little has changed in American life since then, Paul said in The Guardian. It seems as though America has always been split between people who believe in the individual above everything else and those people who believe that we're responsible for one another. This is why we need fiction, and this is why we need Paul Auster. Please help me welcome him to Sixth and I.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming. It's such a big, beautiful crowd. I would guess it's what, about 1.5 million people in here? But probably more, right? Well, the structure of the book was very eloquently described, so I won't have to do that myself. I'm going to be giving a lot of readings from this book in the weeks and months ahead. I started the other night, and I read something, and I decided every time I do it, I'm going to read a different part of the book. And since I've come here to a place that I've started to call in my mind Crazy Town, I thought that I'm going to read little extracts from one part of the book which deal with politics very directly. I should say the novel itself is not only about that. It's about many things. And but one of the Fergusons, the one I call Ferguson 1, does grow up to become a journalist. And so he is more actively paying attention to what's going on around him than the others. And he is a boy who grows up in New Jersey. He's born in Newark. And when he's very small, the family moves to Montclair. The father has suffered some reverses in his business, and after having a large appliance store, he's had this little store in Montclair, and then he's sold it. And Ferguson's mother, Rose, who's a photographer, has become a photojournalist for the Newark Star-Ledger. And sometime around 1965 or so, they moved back to Newark, which was a very unusual, impossible thing to do back then. The Jewish families from Newark were trying to get into the suburbs, not go back to Newark. But Archie One's family goes back. So in 1967, the first extract I'm going to read, Ferguson is 20 years old. It's the summer. And his girlfriend, Amy Schneiderman, who's a Barnard student, and they've been an item now for several years. She's off in California doing a summer job, and he's alone in New York, sweating it out with a boring job in the city. So, July 1967. In Ferguson's opinion, the saddest part of the sad Newark riots was that nothing could have stopped them from happening. Unlike most large events that occurred in the world, which also might not have occurred if people had been thinking more clearly, Vietnam, for example, Newark was unavoidable. Not to the extent of 26 people killed, perhaps, or 700 people injured, or 1,500 people arrested, or 900 businesses destroyed, or $10 million in property damage. But Newark was a place where everything had been going wrong for years, and the 6 days of violence that began on July 12th were the logical outcome of a situation that could be addressed only through violence of one sort or another. That the war broke out when a black cab driver named John Smith was arrested for illegally passing a police car and then bludgeoned by two white cops was not a cause so much as an effect. If it hadn't been Smith, it would have been Jones. If it hadn't been Jones, it would have been brown or white or gray. In the event, it happened to be Smith. And when he was dragged into the 4th Precinct station house by arresting officers John DeSimone and Vito Pontrelli, a rumor quickly spread among the residents of the large public housing project across the street that Smith had been murdered. Not true, as it turned out. But the deeper truth was that Newark's population was more than 50% black now, and most of those 220,000 people were poor. Newark had the highest percentage of substandard housing in the country, the second highest crime rate, the second highest infant mortality rate, and an unemployment rate double the national average. The municipal government was all white. The police department was 90% white, and nearly every construction contract was awarded to companies controlled by the mob, which thanked the city officials who helped them with generous kickbacks and refused to hire black workers because they didn't belong to the all-white unions. The system was so corrupt that City Hall was commonly referred to as the Steelworks, S-T-E-A-L. Once upon a time, Newark had been a town where people made things, a town of factories and blue-collar jobs, and every object on earth had been manufactured there, from wristwatches to vacuum cleaners to lead pipes, from bottles to bottle brushes to buttons, from packaged bread to cupcakes to foot-long Italian salamis. Now the wood stick houses were falling apart, the factories had shut down, and the white middle class was moving to the suburbs. Ferguson's parents had done that as long ago as 1950, and as far as he could tell, they were the only ones who would ever come back. But Weequahic wasn't really Newark. It was a Jewish town at the southwestern edge of an imaginary Newark, and everything had been tranquil there since the beginning of time. 70,000 Jews in one place, a splendid 311-acre park designed by Olmsted, and a high school that produced more PhDs than any other high school in the country. Ferguson had been drinking beer at the West End on the evening of the 12th, and when he returned to his apartment, I should mention his father is a man of few words, and when he returned to his apartment a few minutes after 1 o'clock, the telephone was ringing. He picked up and heard his father shouting into the receiver, "Where the hell have you been, Archie? Newark is burning. They've smashed in the windows and looted the stores. The cops are blasting their guns, and your mother is out there on Springfield Avenue taking pictures for her goddamn paper. They've cordoned off the street, and I can't get in there. Come home, Archie. I need you here, and don't forget to bring your press card." It was too late to think about going downtown to catch a bus from the Port Authority terminal, so Ferguson flagged a taxi on Broadway and told the driver to step on it, a phrase he had heard dozens of times in movies, but had never once uttered himself. And while the trip cost him all but $2 of the $34 in his wallet, he made it back to the apartment house on Van Velser Place in under an hour. Thankfully, the streets of the neighborhood were calm. The rioting had begun in the Central Ward and had later spread to parts of downtown, but the South Ward was still untouched. Even more reassuring, his mother had just come home, and his overwrought, semi-unhinged father was beginning to find his hinges again. "I've never seen anything like it," his mother said. Molotov cocktails, gutted stores, cops with their guns out, fires, frenzied people running all over the place. Pure chaos. I should add, too, his father's now working for a friend of his in a sporting goods store in downtown Newark. "Sam's store is gone," his father said. "He called an hour ago and told me there's nothing left." Crazy, wild animals, that's what they are. Imagine burning down your own neighborhood. It's the stupidest thing I've ever heard of. "I'm going to bed," his mother announced. "I'm all done in, and I have to be at the Ledger first thing tomorrow." "No more of this," his father said. "No more of what, Stanley?" "No more war photography. It's my job. I have to do it. One person in his family is already out of work because of tonight, and there's no way I'm not going to do it." "You'll get yourself killed." "No, I won't. I think it's nearly done now. Everyone was going home when I left. The party's over." Or so she thought, and so thought many others as well. Even the mayor, Hugh Adonisio, who shrugged off the disturbance as nothing more than a few, quote, broken bottles. But when rioting started up again the following night, she was back in the streets with her camera. And this time, Ferguson was with her, carrying his press cards from both the Montclair Times and the Columbia Spectator, in case he was stopped by the police and asked to identify himself. His father had spent the day with Sam Brownstein at his wrecked sporting goods establishment, assessing the damage, boarding up what had once been the front window with sheets of plywood, salvaging the few things that had been left behind. And he was still with Sam when Ferguson and his mother headed for Springfield Avenue after sundown. In his father's mind, Ferguson was there to protect his mother. But in Ferguson's mind, he was there because he wanted to be there, since his mother didn't need to be protected as she went about her job of taking pictures, which he did with remarkable calm and discipline, he felt, so poised and concentrated on her work that it wasn't long before he realized that she, in fact, was the one who was protecting him. A large contingent of journalists and photographers had gathered in the Central Ward that night. People from the Newark papers, the New York papers, Life magazine, Time and Newsweek, the AP, Reuters, the underground press, the black press, radio and television crews, and they mostly stuck together as they watched the tumult unfurl along Springfield Avenue. It was a disturbing thing to witness, and Ferguson openly admitted to himself that he was on edge, at times even frightened. But he was also stirred up and amazed, utterly unprepared for the explosiveness of the energy rippling through the street, the mixture of high emotion and reckless movement that seemed to fuse anger and joy into a feeling he had never encountered anywhere else, a new feeling that had yet to be given a name. And not only was it not crazy, as his father had said it wasn't stupid either, for the black mob was systematically going after businesses owned by white people, many of them Jewish white people, and at the same time sparing businesses owned by black people, the storefronts with the words "Soul Bro" written across them. And in that way, they were telling the white man he was looked upon as an enemy invader, and it was time for him to leave their country. It wasn't that Ferguson thought that this was a good idea, but at least it made sense. Again, the rioting eventually petered out, and again, everyone went home, and this time it seemed to have ended for good, the second night of a two-night binge of destruction and anarchic release. But what no one in the departing crowd could have known then was that at 2:20 in the morning, Mayor Adonisio had called Governor Richard Hughes and asked him to send in the National Guard and the New Jersey State Police. By daybreak, 3,000 guardsmen were rolling through the city in tanks. 500 heavily armed state troopers were taking up their positions in the streets of the Central Ward. And for the next 3 days, the Vietnam War came home to Newark. For if no Viet Cong had ever called Muhammad Ali nigger, now the black people of Newark have been turned into the Viet Cong. Governor Hughes, this is a criminal insurrection by people who say they hate the white man, but who really hate America. Barbed wire checkpoints, a 10 p.m. curfew for cars, everyone off the streets by 11. The looting had stopped, and the exaltation of the first 2 nights had devolved into urban warfare, an all-out battle in which the weapons were rifles, machine guns, and fires. A white fire department captain named Michael Moran, 38 years old, the father of 6 children, was shot and killed while standing on a ladder investigating an alarm on Central Avenue. And from that point on, the Guard and the state police acted on the assumption that the city was infested with black snipers perched on rooftops, aiming to gun down any whites they saw. That 24 of the 26 people killed during those days turned out to be black would seem to have disproved that assumption. But it allowed the Guard and the troopers to fire off 13,000 rounds of ammunition, shooting directly into the second-floor apartment of a woman named Rebecca Brown, for example, and killing her in what the Star-Ledger described as, quote, a fusillade of bullets, or to blast 23 other bullets into the body of Jimmy Rutledge, or to shoot down 24-year-old Billy Furr for the crime of taking a cold soda out of an already ransacked convenience store and handing it to a thirsty photographer from Life magazine. Through it all, Ferguson's mother did what she could to go on taking her pictures, but she necessarily had to work by day, photographing the tanks and soldiers in the now demolished black businesses throughout the Central Ward, hundreds of pictures documenting whatever aspects of the conflagration she considered relevant. And because Ferguson's father had whipped himself into a panic about Rosa's safety, he insisted on accompanying her wherever she went, which for those 3 days entailed sitting with her in the back seat of the old Impala, that's Ferguson's car, as Ferguson drove his parents around the city. And then, as the curfew approached, dropping off the rolls of undeveloped film at the Star-Ledger building before returning to the apartment on quiet Van Velser Place. Ferguson's admiration for his mother continued to grow throughout the horror of those days. That a 45-year-old woman who had spent her life as a studio portrait photographer and had started in journalism by shooting pictures of suburban garden parties could go out and do what she was doing now struck him as one of the most improbable human transformations he had ever seen. That was his one consolation, for everything else about that time made him sick. Sick at heart, sick to his stomach, sick about the world he lived in. And it didn't help that his father ranted every night about them, the goddamn Schwarzes, and how much they hated us, the Jews. And this was the end, he declared. He would hate them back everlastingly from this moment forward, hate them furiously every minute until the day he died. And during one of those rants, Ferguson became so disgusted that he lost his temper and told his father to shut up, which he had never done before in his life. The troops pulled out on the 17th, and by the time the last tank left the city, the war was over. Everything else was over as well, at least for the Jews of Weequahic, who seemed to be of one mind with Ferguson's father about what had happened, and within 6 months, nearly every family in the area was gone. Some of them moving to nearby Elizabeth, others heading to the suburbs of Essex and Morris counties, and a neighborhood that had once been all Jews had no Jews in it anymore. How odd that most of the parents and grandparents of the black people who lived in Newark had come up from the south during the Great Migration between the wars. And now, because his mother's photographs of the riots had made a certain mark in the world, and she had been offered a new job at the Miami Herald, his parents were trading places with their black neighbors and heading south themselves. It was terrible to see them go. Jumping ahead, it's 6 months later or so, and this little section is entitled Early 1968. Ferguson saw the situation as a series of concentric circles. The outer circle was the war and all that went with it. American soldiers in Vietnam, enemy combatants from the north and the south, Viet Cong, Ho Chi Minh, the government in Saigon, Lyndon Johnson and his cabinet, U.S. foreign policy since the end of World War II, body counts, napalm, burning villages, hearts and minds, escalation, pacification, peace with honor. The second represented America, the 200 million on the home front, the press, newspapers, magazines, radio, television, the anti-war movement, the pro-war movement, the Black Power movement, the counterculture movement, hippies and yippies, pot and LSD, rock and roll, the underground press, Zap comics, the merry pranksters, the motherfuckers, the hard hats and the love it or leave it crowd, the empty air occupied by the so-called generation gap between middle-class parents and their children, and the vast throng of nameless citizens who would come to be known as the silent majority. The third circle was New York, which was almost identical to the second circle, but more immediate, more vivid, a laboratory filled with examples of the aforementioned social currents that Ferguson could perceive directly with his own eyes rather than through the filter of written words or published images, all the while taking into account the nuances and particularities of New York itself, which was different from all other cities in the United States, especially because of the enormous divide between rich and poor. The fourth circle was Columbia, Ferguson's temporary abode, the close-to-hand little world that surrounded him and his fellow students, the encompassing ground of an institution no longer walled off from the big world outside it, for the walls had come down, and the outside was now indistinguishable from the inside. The fifth circle was the individual, each individual person in any one of the four other circles. But in Ferguson's case, the individuals who counted most were the ones he knew personally, above all the friends he shared his life with at Columbia, and above all those others, of course, the individual of individuals, the dot at the center of the smallest of the five circles, the person who was himself. 5 realms, 5 separate realities, but each one was connected to the others, which meant that when something happened in the outer circle, the war, the effects could be felt throughout America, New York, Columbia, and every last dot in the inner circle of private individual lives. When the war escalated in the spring of 1967, for example, 500,000 people marched in the streets of New York on April 15th to condemn the war and call for the immediate withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam. 5 days after that, on the Columbia campus uptown, 300 members of SDS, that's Students for Democratic Society, it was the left-wing political organization of students up there then, 300 members of SDS showed up at John Jay Hall, quote, to ask some questions of the Marine recruiters who had set up their tables in the lobby and were attacked by a charging gang of 50 jocks and ROTC boys, which led to a bloody scuffle, a flying fist, and bashed-in noses that had to be broken up by the police. The following afternoon, the largest demonstration at Columbia in over 30 years was held in the Van Am quadrangle between John Jay and Hamilton Halls as 800 members and supporters of SDS protested Marine recruiting on campus, and 500 pro-Marine jock hecklers threw eggs at them from the other side of the fence on South Field in their own counter-demonstration. Ferguson and Amy, and I should say Amy is an active SDS member, and Ferguson is writing for the school paper. Ferguson and Amy had both been involved in that hectic scene, she as a participant and he as a witness reporter. And when he told her about his concentric circles theory that night at the West End, she smiled at him and said, "But of course, my dear Holmes, how clever of you." The point was that no one was happy on either side. The pro-war people were becoming more and more frustrated by Johnson's failure to win the war. And the anti-war people were becoming more and more frustrated by their failure to force Johnson to end the war. Meanwhile, the war continued to grow. 500,000 troops, 550,000 troops. And the bigger it became, the more the outer circle, pressed in on the other circles, squeezing them ever more tightly together. And before long, the spaces between them had shrunk to the merest slivers of air, which was making it hard for the lone ones trapped in the center to breathe. And when a person can't breathe, he starts to panic. And panic is something close to craziness, a feeling that you have lost your mind and are about to die. And by early 1968, Ferguson was beginning to feel that everyone had gone crazy as the crazy people who talked out loud to themselves on Broadway. And bit by bit, he had become as crazy as everyone else. Then, in those early months of the new year, everything began to snap. The shock attacks by Viet Cong sapper commandos on more than 100 South Vietnamese cities and towns during the Tet Offensive on January 30th proved that America could never win the war, even though American troops fought back and overwhelmed the enemy in every battle of the offensive, killing 37,000 Viet Cong compared to the 2,000 lost by the U.S., with tens of thousands of other Viet Cong fighters either wounded or captured, and 500,000 South Vietnamese civilians turned into homeless refugees. The message to the American people was that the North Vietnamese would never give up, and they would go on fighting until the last person in their country was dead. And how many more American soldiers would it take to destroy that country? Would the 500,000 already there have to be increased to 1 million, to 2 million, to 3 million? And if so, would the destruction of North Vietnam not also mean the destruction of America? 2 months later, Johnson appeared on television and announced that he would not be running for re-election in the fall. It was an admission of failure, an acknowledgement that public support for the war had eroded to such a point that his policies had been rejected. And Ferguson, who had admired the good Johnson of the War on Poverty and the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and had loathed the bad Johnson of Vietnam, found himself in the uncomfortable position of feeling sorry for the President of the United States, at least for a minute or two, as he tried to put himself in the head of Lyndon Johnson and experienced the anguish he must have felt in deciding to abdicate his throne. And then Ferguson felt glad, both glad and relieved, that LBJ would soon be gone. 5 days after that, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis. Another bullet fired by an American nobody, another blow to the collective nervous system. And then hundreds of thousands of people ran out into the streets and started smashing windows and setting buildings on fire. 128 Newarks. The 5 concentric circles had merged into a single black disc. It was an LP record now, and the song it kept playing was an old blues number called "Can't Take It No More Sugar, 'Cause My Heart Hurts So Bad." Amy is a senior, Ferguson is a junior. They're only 3 months apart in age, but she's a year ahead of him in school. Spring 1968, 1. Amy was seldom around anymore. It was her last semester at Barnard. And because she had already fulfilled her academic requirements and had nearly enough points to graduate, her course load was exceptionally light that spring, which allowed her to spend most of her time doing political work with SDS. Until then, Ferguson's greatest worry had been Berkeley Law, which accepted her in early April, a few days after King was murdered in Memphis. But now he was afraid he would lose her before the summer began. Her positions had hardened during the crazy-making months of early '68, pushing her deeper into a stance of radical militancy and anti-capitalist fervor, and she could no longer laugh off their small differences of opinion, no longer understand why he didn't agree with her on all her points. "If you accept my analysis," she said to him one day, "then you necessarily have to accept my conclusions." "No, I don't," Ferguson replied. "Just because capitalism is the problem doesn't mean that SDS is going to make capitalism disappear. I'm trying to live in the real world, Amy, and you're dreaming about things that are never going to happen." One example. Now that Johnson had withdrawn, Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy were both running for the Democratic presidential nomination. Ferguson was distinctly unexcited and didn't support either one of them. But he paid close attention to their campaigns, especially to Kennedy's, since it was clear to him that McCarthy had no chance. For even if he was lukewarm about the New York senator, he felt that RFK was a better choice than discredited Humphrey, and any Democrat was preferable to Nixon or, even more troubling, Ronald Reagan, the governor of Amy's future state, who was even farther to the right than Goldwater. It wasn't that Ferguson felt any enthusiasm for the Democrats, but it was important to make distinctions, he told himself. Important to recognize that there were bad things in this flawed world, but also even worse things. And when it came to voting in an election, better to go for the bad over the worse. Amy refused to make those kinds of distinctions anymore. As far as she was concerned, the Democrats were all the same, each one a sellout liberal, and she wanted no part of them. They were the ones who were responsible for Vietnam and all the other horrors America had visited upon the world, and a pox on them and everything they stood for. And if the Republicans happened to win, well, maybe that would be better for the country in the long run, because America would be turned into a fascist police state, and eventually the people would rise up against it, as if the people who had just elected the Republicans would want to overthrow them once they came to power, as if the people might not prefer to live in a fascist police state if it would lock up anti-American radicals like her. The girl who had wept over the murder of John Kennedy in 1963 now saw his brother Robert as a tool of capitalist oppression. Ferguson was willing to shrug off such remarks as an excess of ideological enthusiasm. But by early April, he too was coming under attack, and the political had suddenly become personal, too much about them rather than the ideas they were discussing. Ferguson wondered if Amy wasn't carrying on a secret dalliance with one of her SDS brethren, or if she and her Barnard pal, Patsy Dugan, weren't exploring the mysteries of sapphic love together. She talked about Patsy a lot these days. Or if she wasn't still irritated with him for not having gone to California with her last summer. No, not possible, he realized. None of those possibilities was even dimly possible, for it wasn't in Amy's nature to do things behind his back. And if she had fallen for someone else, she would have told him about it. And if she still resented him for last summer, it couldn't have been a conscious resentment, since that had been over and done with for months. And in the months after that, there had been countless good times together, not to mention how glorious she had been in the sad days after his grandmother's death, taking up the slack from his nearly immobilized mother and orchestrating the apartment clean-out with the speed and precision of a Sandy Koufax fastball. Something had happened since then, however, and if it hadn't been caused by any of the usual causes, it also seemed impossible that it could have been caused by a stupid disagreement about politics. He and Amy had always disagreed. One of the pleasures of living with her was the extent to which they disagreed and yet continued to love each other in spite of that. Their battles had always been fought about ideas, never about themselves. But now Amy had started going after him because his ideas didn't mesh with hers, because he was reluctant to jump into the revolutionary volcano with her. And therefore, he had become a backward-thinking reactionary liberal, a pessimist, an ironist, an agent-bite of Inuit boy, meaning he supposed that he was too fond of Joyce and all things literary, a bystander, a dilettante, an old fogey, and a lump of shit. From Ferguson's point of view, it all came down to one essential difference. Amy was a believer, and he was an agnostic. One night, when she was out late with her friends, no doubt arguing with Mike Loeb in a booth at the West End or plotting with Patsy Dugan about how to increase the female membership of SDS, Ferguson crawled into the bed in Amy's room. They're in the same apartment. There are other roommates there. Crawled into the bed in Amy's room, the same bed he had slept in for the better part of the past 2 years. And because he was especially tired that night, he fell asleep before Amy returned. When he woke the next morning, Amy was not in the bed beside him. And when he examined the plumped-up state of her pillow, he concluded that Amy had not come home and had spent the night somewhere else. Somewhere else turned out to be the bed in Ferguson's room next door. And when he walked into that room to look for a fresh set of socks and underwear, the noise of the creaking parquet floor woke her up. "What are you doing in here?" Ferguson asked. "I felt like sleeping alone," she said. "Oh? It felt good to sleep alone for a change." "Did it?" "Yes, very good. I think we should keep on doing it for a while, Archie. You in your bed and me in my bed. What you might call a cooling off period." if that's what you want. It's not as though it's been very warm lately when we've slept together in the same bed. Thank you, Archie. You're welcome, Amy. Thus commenced the so-called cooling off period. For the next 6 nights, Ferguson and Amy slept alone in their own beds, in their own rooms, neither one of them certain if they had come to the end or were merely taking a pause. And on the morning of the 7th day, April 23rd, just hours after they climbed out of their separate beds and made their separate ways out of the apartment, the revolution began. So this is the mess at Columbia, and I'm skipping 10 pages of a lot of background. Spring 1968, 3. Never before in the annals of, never before so much as thought. The widening gyre, and all at once everyone turning within it. Nobodaddy doubled over with stomach cramps, the shits. Hotspur hopping, a shape with lion body and the head of man, a horde. How, who, what, and all suddenly asking him, why darkness and obscurity and all thy words and laws? The center could not, the things could not, the horde could not do other than it did. But anarchy was not loosed. It was the world that loosened, at least for a time, and thus began the largest, most sustained student protest in American history. So I'm going to jump really far and I can't go into all this. It's too complicated. And I'm going to end with the last business. Now, just to tell you the story, 5 buildings were occupied. Hundreds of students were involved. After 7 days, the Columbia administration called in the police and evicted them. It arrested 700 people. And it was a bloody police riot on the campus. There were black students occupying one building. They went out peacefully. Columbia was so scared that Harlem was going to run onto the Morningside Heights campus and burn it down that they treated the black students very carefully, got them out, but they didn't really care about the white students. And so here it is, the last bit, and this is April 30th, 1968. Whether Ferguson was right or wrong, the cops were eventually called in at the close of the 7th day of the occupations, and at 2:30 in the morning on April 30th, an hour, as someone pointed out, when Harlem was asleep, the bust began. 1,000 helmeted troops from the New York City riot police fanned out across the campus as 1,000 onlookers stood in the chill and the damp of that eeriest of all black nights, while others swarmed and howled and chanted "No violence" at the police, and the blue bands cheered them on, those are the right-wing students, and the white bands, those are the teachers, and the green bands, the supporters of the strike, tried to block the TPF from entering the buildings. And the first thing Ferguson noticed was the animosity that existed between the police and the students, a mutual resentment that had nothing to do with the white-black antagonisms everyone had feared, but white-white class hatred. The privileged students and the bottom-rung cops who saw the Columbia boys and girls as rich, spoiled, anti-American hippie brats, and the professors who supported them were no better. Pompous anti-war intellectual radicals, Reds, the rancid poisoners of young minds. So first they took care of evacuating Hamilton and getting the blacks out as smoothly as they could. And because there was no resistance from the proud, tightly organized students of Malcolm X University, which is how the building was renamed, who had voted not to resist and calmly let the police escort them through the tunnels under the building to the paddy wagons that were parked outside. Not one punch was thrown at them, not one nightstick cracked down on any of their skulls. And Columbia, through no efforts of its own, managed to escape the wrath of Harlem. By then, the water supply to the other buildings had been shut off, and one by one, the TPF and their plainclothes undercover men set about clearing Avery, Low, Fairweather, and Math, where the occupying students were hurriedly reinforcing the barricades they had erected behind the doors. But each building had its own battalion of white bands and green bands in front of it, and they were the ones who got the worst of the pounding, the ones who were clubbed and punched and kicked as the cops plowed through them with crowbars to force open the locks and then charge in to bust up the barricades and arrest the students inside. No, it wasn't Newark, Ferguson kept telling himself as he watched the police go about their business. No shots were being fired, and therefore no one was going to be killed. But just because it wasn't as bad as Newark didn't mean it wasn't grotesque. For there was Alexander Platt, associate dean of the college, being punched in the chest by a cop. And there was philosopher Stanley Morgenbesser, he of the white sweaters and he of the white sneakers and unraveling sweaters and zinging ontological quips, being banged over the head by a nightstick as he stood guard at the back entrance of Fairweather Hall. And there was a young reporter from the New York Times, Robert McG. Thomas Jr., showing his press card as he mounted the stairs at Avery Hall and being ordered to quit the building, at which point he was slugged in the head by a cop using a pair of handcuffs as brass knuckles, then shoved down the stairs and hit with a dozen billy clubs as he tumbled to the bottom. And there was Steve Shapiro, a photographer from Life magazine, being punched in the eye by one cop as another cop smashed his camera. And there was a doctor from the volunteer first aid crew, dressed in doctor's whites, being thrown to the ground, kicked, and dragged off to a paddy wagon. And there were dozens of male and female students being jumped by plainclothesmen hiding in the bushes and having their heads and faces clunked by saps, sticks, and pistol butts. Dozens of students stumbling around with blood pouring from their scalps and foreheads and eyebrows. And then, after all the demonstrators in the buildings had been pulled out and carted away, the phalanx of TPF warriors began systematically moving back and forth across Southfield to clear the campus of the hundreds who remained, charging into crowds of defenseless students and pummeling them to the ground. And there were the mounted police on Broadway, going at full gallop after the lucky ones who had eluded the clubs in the campus assault. And there was Ferguson, trying to do his job as reporter for his humble student rag, being hit on the back of the head by a billy club wielded by yet another undercover man dressed to look like a student, the same head that had been stitched up in 11 places 4.5 years earlier. And as Ferguson fell to the ground from the impact of the blow, someone else stomped on his left hand with the heel of a boot or a shoe, the same hand that was already missing its thumb and 2/3 of its index finger. And when the foot came down on him, Ferguson felt the hand must have been broken, which turned out not to be true. But how it hurt, and how quickly it swelled up afterwards, and how much, from that moment on, he came to despise cops. 720 people arrested, nearly 150 injuries reported, with untold numbers of unreported injuries as well, among them the knocks that had been delivered to Ferguson's head and hand. The editorial in that day's Spectator had no words in it, just the masthead, followed by 2 blank columns bordered in black. I'll stop there. Thanks. Thank you. They want me. They want you to ask questions and for me to answer them. So if anyone has any questions, fire away.
Hi. It's an honor to meet you. And as a fellow baseball fan, I grew up in a small town called Williamsport, Maryland. In Sunset Park, you wrote about Boots Poffenberger, who just happened to be from Williamsport.
That's right.
How did you know about? I grew up there. I didn't even know he lived there until I read your book.
Well, you know, if you're a maniac like me, you scour the baseball encyclopedia from time to time looking for funny names. And Boots really qualifies as one of the funniest names ever in the history of baseball. So, happened to be from there.
Well, thank you.
That's a great question. Okay.
Hello, sir.
Hi.
It's a pleasure listening to you. When you were talking about the civil rights riots observed by a man called Ferguson, I was thinking about the riots that I saw in Ferguson. I went there several times. Just wondering whether I'm a journalist, and I was just wondering whether you were thinking of what has been happening over the last few years in this country in terms of the riots and the looting in several places. And a lot of the people I spoke to there and in other places said, we need this kind of violence and the civil rights struggle is not over. Is that something you would agree with?
Well, I do agree, and the uncanny thing is, I was originally intending to call my book Ferguson. That was going to be the title. And about a year and a half into working on the novel, this terrible thing happened in a place I'd never heard of, Ferguson, Missouri. And to title a novel Ferguson, after what happened there, everyone would think the book was about that, which it clearly isn't. But the more I wrote, and I spent years working on this book, the parallels just kept jumping out at me. So that by the time I was finished, I kept thinking that we're just where we were 50 years ago. It's a divided country. The racial problems are terrible, as they were then. And we're going backwards. We're not moving forward. And then I finished the book, and Trump was not even, he wasn't on the radar yet. I mean, he was running, but I didn't think he was going to win. And well, it just keeps getting worse. That's all I can say. It's the one thing. That one person is creating 100 problems every day and driving everyone insane. We're all going to have nervous breakdowns pretty soon, it seems. So what paper or organization do you work for?
I work for French TV.
French TV?
France 24, yeah.
Oh, I know that station. Yeah.
So I observe things from a distance, I suppose. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thanks.
Well, that was wonderful. As somebody who, at the time you're writing about, quaffed a few beers at the West End.
Yeah,
you
what a
brought
place
back
that was, huh?
a lot of memories. I just wanted to read you something. This is Philip Roth, since you talked about Newark, writing in 1961, in which he says, the American writer in the middle of the 20th century has his hands full in trying to understand and then describe and then make credible much of the American reality. The actuality is continually outdoing our talents, and the culture tosses up figures almost daily that are the envy of any novelist.
Well, that's a famous article that he wrote,
Right.
and people still quote it. But it didn't prevent old Philip Roth from grinding out many novels after 1961. So he hasn't prevented novelists from doing the things that our introducer talked about, because the novels remain crucial business.
Right. But more and more using what you just did, the reality, to make the fiction more.
Listen, there are historical things in my novel, but as I tried to explain, these passages I read are very unusual. These are special, and most of the book doesn't sound like this. It's really inside the characters. But these events, by the time we get to this, you know these characters so well that it's possible for the reader to leave them behind a little bit and imagine them going through all these things. But coming to it cold like this, people who haven't read the book, it sounds like a history text, but it's not.
It's not. Okay. Well, I look forward to reading the
Good.
book. Thanks.
Good.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of your work. It's a pleasure to hear you speak. Some of the major themes across all your work, both in fiction and nonfiction, is faith, coincidence, chance, luck. I want to ask you, why are you fascinated with this aspect of human life?
Well, it's hard to explain exactly why, but I can tell you, I've written about it, so it's not something I'm revealing tonight. But I think it's actually the heart of this book and why I wrote this book. It was something that happened to me when I was 14 years old. And I was at a summer camp in New York State, and there were about 20 of us, 20 boys, and a couple of counselors went on a hike in the woods. And we got stuck in a very violent electric storm. Lightning shooting down around us, huge thunder, and a deluge of rain. I mean, really horrendous rain. So the lightning was very scary, and it was agreed among us. We were all city kids. We didn't really know what to do. But someone said, well, get to a clearing, get away from the trees, it's safer, which turns out to be true. Well, we found a clearing, and in order to get to it, we had to crawl under a barbed wire fence. So we went single file underneath. And I was behind one boy who halfway through, sort of midway through the fence, lightning struck the fence and killed him. It electrocuted him on the spot. And I was this far away from him. So I understood then that anything can happen at any time to anybody. And I was 14. You know what a vulnerable age 14 is. You're just beginning to figure out something about who you are and what the world is. So I've been haunted by that all my life. And I think maybe if I dwell on this sometimes, it's because of that. But at the same time, if you read this little book of mine called The Red Notebook, which is all true stories, the weirdest things have happened to me from the very beginning of my life, and they continue to happen now. So it's a strange world out there, and people don't want to give it, to allow it to be as unpredictable and crazy as it really is. And here in Crazy Town, maybe you're beginning to understand it. I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about your creative work? I mean, your creative process. How do you gather material for your books? And if that's too much of a broad question, a little bit of your life and the moment that you realized that you were going to be a writer and do that for a living.
Well, I don't know where all these ideas come from. They just come. I don't look for them. I just, somehow, I'm trapped by them. They find me, and then they tell me that I need to write about them. I reluctantly agree, eventually, after putting up some resistance. But I wanted to write from an early age. I was even writing things when I was about 9 or 10 years old. I mean, really wretched things. I mean, the stupidest poems, the most abominable stories ever conceived of. You know, very influenced by Robert Louis Stevenson and Edgar Allan Poe. You know, I'd start stories with the words, in the year of our Lord, 1751. I was walking through an enormous blizzard, you know, looking for my ancestral home. This kind of garbage. And I thought it was just so wonderful. But I liked doing it. And I felt that the act of writing made me feel better than most other things made me feel, except maybe playing baseball. Those are the two things I like best. And so when I was around 15, I was getting older, a little more sophisticated, I read Crime and Punishment. And that book affected me so deeply. It shook me up, and from top to bottom. And after I was done, I said, if this is what a novel can be, if this is what a novel can do to a person, then I want to write novels. And
Thank you.
That's it.
Hi, Mr. Auster. Thank you for being here. I'm really delighted to be here. I never imagined I could listen to you. And yeah, he already asked a little bit what I wanted to know. But first of all, I'd like to know, after all these novels, so many novels you've written, what are still the questions and the issues that appeal to you as a writer and as a person? And secondly, you have written 4 lives for the same character in this novel. Have you ever indulged yourself in imagining 4 lives different for you? And in any of those lives, are you anything different from a writer? Thank you.
It's a lot of questions. Well, I think we all ask this question, what if? You know, what if we had turned left instead of right? What if you'd grown up somewhere else? What if your parents had been killed in a car crash when you were 3 years old? What if you had grown up during a war, living in an occupied city? What if you had lived through a typhoon or an earthquake or a plague of some sort? All the things that can happen and do happen to millions of people. So yeah, you speculate. I think everyone speculates. I mean, the greatest question to ask people a married couple is how did they meet? And often it's completely by chance. I went to the bus stop and I missed the bus, so I sat down and I was waiting for the next one, and while I was sitting there, this beautiful woman sat down and we started talking, and a year later we were married. And then the child produced by this marriage is the result of somebody missing a bus, and a human being is then walking the earth because somebody wasn't running fast enough to catch the bus. I find these questions really interesting to think about.
Paul, you and I went to summer camp together.
Who am I looking at?
John Vine. John Vine.
Oh, hi.
Not New York State, not
No.
where the incident occurred.
No, it
New
was
Hampshire.
New Hampshire, I remember. Yeah. We had a fight, you and I, didn't we? No?
No,
All right, there was somebody in that New Hampshire place
yes.
I had a fight with.
not me.
Okay.
You would have won, but
Maybe his name was Vogel. I was a V, somebody with a V.
Schulman.
Okay, whatever. You remember better. We were little men then.
We were. How did we end up there? You were from Newark, I was from Trenton. You were Jewish, I was Jewish. This camp was not Jewish.
No, not at all. It was.
How did we end up there?
I
have
don't
no
know.
idea.
Well, I know how I wound up there, because I had a friend in my New Jersey town who was not Jewish, who went to that camp, and he said, come to the camp with me. I was 8, and then I went back when I was 10 also. I went there twice, way up in the White Mountains.
Right, Mount Chikarawa,
North Conway, New Hampshire.
North Conway.
Yeah. So,
Good to see you.
Good to see you, too.
It's a-
Hi, Paul. I'm John, and we went to different camps together. I'm interested in your second artistic sidelight, that is film. You wrote a book that was Book of Illusions, which was about 3/4 different screenplays almost.
Well, not really, but there's a lot about
there's tremendous
imaginary
amounts.
films, yeah.
So my first question is, how did you ever do that? Did you watch a lot of Keaton and Chaplin films? And my second question is one of the films in the book, I think was actually made into a film, Martin Frost.
I made it, yeah. I
Yeah,
did it.
what happened to that film?
What happened to the film?
Yeah,
It came out and it disappeared within about
That's what I
4
thought.
minutes. Yeah,
Can-
but it was released on DVD.
so it's out there somewhere.
It's out there somewhere. Yeah.
And is it different? Is it more elaborate than
No.
the?
Okay.
is it-
Just to tell you, Martin Frost began as a film idea. I had finished a previous film, Lulu on the Bridge, and a German producer was doing a series of short films for German TV, and asked me to do one, sort of films about men and women. And I wrote a film that would have, for half an hour film with 2 characters. And for very complicated reasons, I withdrew it because it had money questions and it's too boring to go into. But I had this text lying around, and when I wrote the novel, The Book of Illusions, no, I should say, before I wrote the novel, I thought this little film could actually be expanded into something bigger. And I made a lot of notes for how to turn it into a feature film, and I put it all away. Then I started writing the novel, and I got to a point where I wanted to show one of Hector Mann's later works. And I remembered Martin Frost. I thought, that would be good. But then when I started working on it, I realized the long version was too long. So I went back to the short version. And then I finished the novel, and 2 or 3 years later, or 4 years later, I said, actually, I want to go back and do the longer version of the film story. So I did, and then the film was made, and very few people have seen it, but it exists.
Do you think it's any good? I mean, why?
Listen, I stand by my work. I wouldn't have done it otherwise. Yeah.
Yeah, my question is about your writing of the book and suggestions for reading. I'm on page 85 now. So I wondered, Did you write it in the order it appears, or
Yes.
did you write, so you didn't do 1.1 all the way
Oh,
through?
no.
and then-
Oh, no. Every novel I've ever written, I start with the first sentence, and then I write the second and the third, and I march all the way to the last. Because so many things happen along the way. How could you plunge in the middle without knowing the beginning? Everything gets altered by the things that have happened previous to the sentence you're writing right now.
And the second question, which I just changed based on your answer, is do you think it'd be a different experience reading the book in order, the way you wrote it, versus reading it like 1.1, 2.1, 3.1?
I think it would be not a good way to read it, because if I thought that was a good way, that's the way I would have published it. But
Well, maybe I'll do it both ways and let you know.
no. You see, the book is it's a whirl, it's a dance, and it spins, and you got to get into the music of it. It's not a scientific formula. It's a human experience, and if you don't read it in the order, the cycles that are, I think you'll miss out on whatever pleasure there might be in it for you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to thank you so much for being here with us tonight, Paul. We'll take these last two questions.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for the wonderful reading. And also in connection with that, you mentioned in your interviews that you write with pen and paper and then type it, and then somebody
Yes.
puts it on
True.
the computer. But recently you have narrated several of your books. Do you enjoy doing it? Does it add to the creative process?
Oh, no, I've actually done audiobooks for quite a few of my books. No, I love reading out loud, and I read this one. Boy, did this take a long time. I mean, I was doing this in the summer in the hot New York. I'd be going into Manhattan, a cramped little studio, and so the audiobook is out, and it's 36 and a half hours.
Yeah, I started listening to it this morning.
So I guess if you're laid up with a terminal illness, it might be something to keep you occupied. Or you're taking a long car trip, right? Yeah, to some other solar system. I don't know.
Good evening. Thank you for spending time with us this evening. So I'm a high school English teacher, and I'm a sucker for authors that I feel like kind of mess with me when I read and like to kind of play tricks with me and get sucked in that way. Tomorrow, I'm starting the New York Trilogy with my seniors who are not so much fans of that. I read them the first two paragraphs, and I think I have them hooked. Good. But I wanted to ask you, if you were talking to my class, how would you advise them to approach the New York Trilogy?
Well, my brilliant wife, Siri Hustvedt, has said this, and I don't know if she's written this, but she certainly said it in public. Art is like sex. If you don't relax, you can't enjoy it. And it's true. You have to just relax and open up and actually look at what's on the page. There's this confounding thing that I think unsophisticated readers do. They reject what they're reading. They want the book to be a different book. And they say, oh, no, why does that happen? I want him to get the girl. Why does he lose the girl? As if to say to Shakespeare, what did you do to Romeo and Juliet? It's not fair. If you just tell them, read what's there, and actually think about what's said, and open their minds to the given on the page, they might enjoy it. But if you resist, all is lost. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.